John, what is your understanding of we? How has your understanding of we changed since the rise of the internet?
Oh, I think it has, in the sense of the opportunity to expand the notion of we to include anyone, anywhere. I think in the past when we talked about we, it was we in our local community, we in our corporation, maybe in our country. But now there's really a global we that is connected in very powerful and increasingly rich ways that will make change happen in a much more effective way than ever before.
So you do relate we closely with transformation, change?
I definitely think that because our institutions were all built around much narrower versions of we, and I think that as we begin to understand that we really is a global we, it will require us to rethink our institutions and our practices.
We are talking about leadership today. You mentioned in one of your articles last year, I think, that you can only be a leader by creating leaders. What is this? If you look especially at companies who are structured very much in hierarchy, so...
Well, I think one of the challenges we have is to really redefine leadership. We've talked about the notion of moving from a world of push to a world of pull. And most of our institutions are organized around push concepts. And in that context, if you're a leader, you're measured by the number of followers, the number of people who will follow your direction, your instructions, and execute what your vision is. And I think that that form of leadership is increasingly challenged because right now, in a more rapidly changing world, if you just have followers, you don't have a lot of innovation and experimentation going on to figure out what is the best way to adapt to the changes, the unexpected changes that we're experiencing. So I do believe that the new role of leadership is to develop other leaders, to continually enhance the leadership capability of anyone who's drawn to them so that all of them together, collectively, can experiment, innovate, and find more effective ways of addressing the changes that are going on around us.
But if you do look into companies, and I mean you're working closely together with companies, do you see this already? Or is it wishful thinking?
It's certainly not widespread at this point. I think that you find in certain parts of the companies this kind of leadership emerging. For example, we've talked a lot about the edges of institutions. Those tend to be the areas where there aren't very effective policies, no detailed manuals written as to how things need to get done. And I think there's an instinctive sense on the part of leaders on these edges that they need people who are willing to take their own initiative, willing to lead in their own domain. And to cultivate that kind of leadership capacity is the only way to really be successful on these edges.
Yesterday in your talk at the Social Business Summit, you were mentioning that we should rather move on in tiny little steps instead of having a huge master plan. What does this mean regarding to leadership?
I think at one level, one way I frame the leadership challenge and opportunity is, on the one hand, to make sense, and then on the other level, to make progress. One of the things people look for in a time of great uncertainty and change is somebody who can help make sense out of all this, see the patterns, help to orient and focus on where the real opportunities are. So that's one level of leadership. The other level is to make progress. And in terms of making progress in a very rapidly changing environment, typically if you develop a detailed blueprint that's massive, that blueprint will be rapidly shown to be totally inappropriate given the changes unexpectedly that have happened. So a far more effective process in that kind of environment is to start with small changes, small moves that go at the most interesting or high potential parts of the environment and can demonstrate the impact of change, and where you can learn very quickly. So one of the roles of a leader, I believe, is to continually encourage people to reflect on the experiences they've had. One of the things we tend not to do, particularly under more and more time pressure, we never step back and say, how did we do? What did we learn from that experience?
Okay.
What worked? What didn't work? And I think leadership in small moves, smartly made, can, on a much more rapid basis, encourage that kind of reflection and learning to occur. So we're learning faster as we make these small moves.
But then we would need processes and tools who allow this kind of reflection.
I think we certainly need tools. I'd say more than processes, we need practices, if I can make that distinction.
Yeah,
I think a process is very tightly defined, tightly integrated. I think practices are something you would do instinctively at different points in time. And it's one of the things that we've learned from looking at World of Warcraft, which is this amazing online environment for gaming, is the degree to which the teams in this game sit back and reflect on the different actions they've taken.
Right.
And it's a very powerful way to learn. And it's something I think a leader ought to be encouraging everybody to do.
So would you consider that playing Warcraft is a good exercise for becoming a good leader?
Well, I've actually gone on record encouraging younger students that to reconsider whether they should go to business school or become a guild leader in World of Warcraft. There are an increasing number of executives now who
are playing.
Who rose to that level because they were guild leaders and developed a set of leadership skills in a very uncertain environment, very challenging environment where you don't have command and control kinds of mechanisms. You have to influence, you have to motivate people to do things. And that's a very powerful set of skills increasingly in the business world.
Nevertheless, you were arguing yesterday having these tiny little steps, but you were also demanding quite strongly a vision.
Yes.
A leader needs a vision, and that many companies exactly lacking this. Isn't this a contradiction?
It's potentially a contradiction. I think the resolution to it is the danger in small steps is you can fall into a very incremental pattern where you're never really changing in a fundamental way what you're doing. You're just enhancing on a very marginal basis your current set of activities. If you have a long-term direction, a view of long-term where you want to be, you can make choices about those small steps in the short term that answer the question of which small step would help us to get to that longer-term destination most effectively. So it's working from the outside in as opposed to just saying, what do I have today, where can I move in a short period of time? And it's constant, and it sets into motion this learning process again, because as you take these small steps, depending on the outcomes, it will help you to refine your view of that long-term future. And on the other hand, the long-term future helps you to evaluate which of the small steps are going to be most helpful to you.
So it's a kind of frame set, this long vision.
It's part of that making sense aspect of leadership. If you can say, yes, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, but generally we're headed in this direction, and this is the implication for what we need to be doing to be successful, that gives the organization, the people who are engaged with you, a much clearer sense of why they're taking these small steps, where it could lead, and again, drive that learning process.
So we're also talking about flow instead of stock. I mean, this is just the example for it, you know. Heading in towards a vision.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yes, I think it highlights again another aspect of leadership that often gets overlooked. Often, particularly in our current institutions, we tend to think of leadership within the institution. It's how do you motivate people within the company. In this new world where flow is becoming more and more central, flows cut across institutions. And so I think increasingly the role of a leader is to identify people outside the institution that also need to help in making sense and making progress so that they can connect in a much more effective way, not just people within their institution, but across institutions, create a much larger movement as a result.
in your book, The Power of Pull, you're also talking, always touching the leadership, the managing problem or case. How does this world of pull affect leadership?
It makes leadership, we believe, even more central to success, but it fundamentally shifts the tasks of leadership. So at one level, one of the roles of leadership that we talk about is helping to create scalable platforms of pull. If you don't have platforms that can scale, and I mean to millions of participants, not just a few participants, you're not going to be as effective in pulling the resources and the people that you need to be successful. At the extreme, the third level of pull that we talk about is pulling out of each of us our full potential as human beings and as institutions. And in that context, the role of leadership is to give us a sense of the potential and possibility, to imagine what could be accomplished and to motivate us to head in that direction. So I think that in that context, leaders are very inspirational in terms of helping us to understand what the full potential really is.
But I think the power of pull, at least as it came to me, is not only a question of tools. It's also, I think, a different question of skills which might be needed, isn't it?
Oh, totally. I mean, it is a situation where you have to have a skill in terms of dealing with ambiguity. You have to have a skill in terms of willingness to take more initiative on your own, which is why this notion that leaders need to be fostering other leaders. You can't just have people who follow orders. You have to have a sense of how to connect much more effectively. One of the things that in a world of pull that's more and more central is how do you build trust-based relationships with more people so you have more flows coming. That's another set of skills that are quite different and where, again, leaders can play a significant role, for example.
Also, yesterday, we touched a lot of topics actually during this conference.
Yes.
We were talking that change always starts, or mostly starts at the edge.
Yes.
So not in the center, in the heart of a company.
Right.
My question would be, how can you lead from the edge? Can you?
Well, I think you not only can, but need to. Again, my sense, having worked with very large institutions for long periods of time, is that it's extraordinarily hard to get change to happen within the core of a large institution. And so the only way to really mobilize and get that critical mass of support for a change agenda is to start with a promising edge. And it could, essentially, when we talk about edges of companies, we're talking about promising new growth platforms. They're not significant parts of the business today. They don't generate much revenue or profitability. There aren't many people. But they have potential to scale very rapidly and become really central to the business over time. And one of the exciting things is with current technologies like cloud computing and social software, you can scale these edges much more rapidly than you could in the past. But it's being thoughtful about which edges have that potential to scale, using those edges to pull in the people who have real passion and risk-taking ability to help drive that change on the edge, demonstrate through example the impact that can be achieved. So you start pulling more and more of the people and resources from the core of the company out to these edges because they now see what is possible and how rapidly this is growing. So it motivates more and more people to participate. And ultimately, if you do it right, these edges become the core of the new enterprise. So that's...
Excuse me. So is this understanding kind of similar, like leadership by innovation? It sounds a bit like this.
It's certainly, I mean, I think that the interesting reframing of innovation in the context of leadership, in most companies today when you talk about innovation, you're talking about a major new product, a major new technology breakthrough, maybe a process innovation, maybe a business innovation. But What we are talking about here is institutional innovation,
Right.
innovating a new set of relationships across institutions that will drive more rapid value creation and enhance flows across institutions.
Yeah.
That is leadership through innovation. The leaders of tomorrow are going to be those who innovate at the institutional level, not just at the product or technology level.
So this kind of leadership you were describing, does it only apply for companies, or is it also good for nations? I mean, what we've been seeing in the Middle East, you told me you were writing about it.
Yes.
Is this a concept which would work for nations, for governments as well?
I think the leadership question does extend beyond companies, and it involves all institutions, whether it's educational institutions, non-governmental institutions, and certainly governments. I think the challenge for all of us is the institutions we have were built under the model of push, and we need to rethink at a fundamental level, how would these institutions operate in a world of pull? What kind of leaders do we need to really not only navigate the transition, but then successfully lead these new kinds of institutions? So it is an issue for government, and I think some of the turmoil that we're seeing around the world is the result of push government institutions increasingly struggling to adapt to and deal with a world of pull.
But, I mean, what happened, for example, in Tunisia or Egypt or in Yemen, he seems to resign as well. Now that actually the governments are broken down, there is nothing which can, take this leadership role. Don Tapscott calls it wiki revolutions, but who is leading these revolutions? What is next in there? I mean, this is a huge challenge. It's a kind of vacuum we have.
No, I agree. There is a vacuum that has emerged. I believe that before leadership can emerge, there needs to be a vacuum to invite that kind of new leadership. So I'm actually more of an optimist that it will emerge. I think the key driver of these revolutions, although it's without much explicit ideology or thought, was an instinctive sense on the part of younger generations that the development of their talent was being sacrificed, and that they needed to oppose the institutions that were preventing them from developing their talent in the way they needed to develop it. So I think the motivation driving this is a very positive one. I think the fact that by and large, with some exceptions, it's been accomplished in a nonviolent way, simply by making a statement and making a stand, is again a very positive indication that there's a different approach here that will ultimately lead to the surfacing of leadership that will give more explicit voice to the agenda that drove this action.
Is this more idealistic, or do you have any kind of proof or kind of more manifested feeling that it could be like this?
Well, I think if you look at the different situations and how they emerged, it was driven by young people who, on the one hand, were reasonably well educated in a school system, but who then went into a society where their talents were basically ignored, and where governments were much more managing to very short-term agendas. Corruption was running widespread. There was mounting government debt in many of these governments. They were all managing for the short term rather than managing for the long-term talent development of their population. And so I think if you just look and talk to the people who were participating in these protests, they give voice to these kinds of issues. And so, again, I'm not sure it was as articulate, and as books weren't written in advance of the revolution. The books will be written, I believe, and I do believe the motivations here are very consistent with the notion of a world of pull, where in times of increasing pressure and uncertainty, if you're not aggressively developing the talent of everybody, you're going to be increasingly marginalized.
Yeah. my very last question would be, which was also a question yesterday, where should this social kind of leadership, social business leadership, or however you would call it, where should it be located within the company? Or is there somebody who has this role? Or isn't this a contradiction in words?
Right.
I mean,
it's a difficult question. I mean, at one level, the whole notion of social business is where leadership is much more distributed and diffuse, and everybody is taking initiative and leadership. But there is a transition question of how do you get there? And how do you deal with the enormous inertia and resistance of the core of these institutions where there are, not to emphasize the difficulty, there are huge entrenched interests who are deeply hostile to this new world of pull and will resist it totally. So I think there is a need for some form of leadership to emerge. Typically, from my experience, it emerges more on the edge of the enterprise. It's some business executive who has been given the responsibility to drive a major new growth initiative. The business executive instinctively realizes that the old approaches aren't going to be very helpful in driving this new business initiative, and they're more risk-taking, they're more willing to, and they're usually deeply passionate about what they're doing. So they tend to attract other people within the organization who have passion as well and who are excited by the fact that there's this area where the processes are not well defined, where the rules are not clear, and yes, there's a lot of risk, but there's a lot of upside and reward available if you succeed.
so it's not necessarily the CTO or CIO of a company.
From my experience, it's rarely any of the existing senior leadership of the large company itself. Sometimes if there's a new CEO that's been brought in and the company is in real danger, real financial pressure, sometimes you can get a significant shift at that level. But usually it's from the edge, from an executive who's really got aspirations to change the game.
Do you think this all can happen without the top-down commitment? I mean, we are speaking about grassroots movements, we are speaking about, people doing tiny little things, kind of islands in huge companies.
Right.
But can this be effective if we don't have the commitment from the board?
It certainly would help to have commitment from the board. I think you rarely get commitment from the entire senior management team. Typically, in my experience, again, you find one or two senior executives who are willing to be kind of sponsors, who are willing to say, we're going to provide some protection for this change agent on the edge. And if that person gets into trouble, we'll help to make sure that we get that person out of trouble. But it's rare that you would see an entire senior leadership team say, we're going for it.
So again, this would be, or would help your statement coming from the edge is the way.
Exactly.
Okay.